I've got a second list, just a few more questions, but these ones came from, I'd say, more rainwater harvesting professionals who were potentially skeptical of this idea that a natural treatment train in of itself could provide acceptable quality water for drinking. And so, we've kind of hit on a lot of these, but I'm going to bring them back up again because this is really important. This is the kind of stuff that people wanting to get into rainwater harvesting and design rainwater harvesting systems are going to hear over and over and over again, both by professionals currently in the industry and by average citizens and even health officials, right?
Yeah, these concerns, Michelle, are quite long running. I read a book that was based on newspaper articles in from 1850 um, in the development of Sydney and Newcastle in Australia, where, and it's quite ironic where the stories come from, but we'll get back to that, where they claim that because the original source of water in Australia after well water and river water was rainwater. That's all they had. So rainwater storage is on the houses. And the history of Australia is that the government got into trouble with the Eureka Stockade, where they tried to put more taxes on gold, and they tried to put taxes on rum, and this sort of happened to you guys with the Boston Tea Party. So, well, not Canadians, but North Americans. So, well, I think the Canadians were associated with the French, so they got away from that battle a little. So the governments were looking for more reasons to tax. So water is a good reason to tax, isn't it? So the colonial government in Australia said, right, we'll build these water systems in Newcastle and Sydney, but people already had their own water supply, so and the colonial government wanted the people to pay a fair bit of money to build their own. They just ran a pipe past their house. It was untreated river water back in those days, so it was fairly poor quality in the mains water systems. So you had to pay to get someone to build a pipe into your house, and then you had to pay the government a tax every year for this water supply. So what happened in Australia? Australia's being a rebellious lot. They said, we're not doing that. We've got our rainwater supply. We're fine. So in the 1850s, there was a whole series of articles in the Sydney Morning Herald about the dirty, filthy colonial Australians who are unclean because they're not buying the government's water. And everyone knows that rainwater makes you really sick. And it was in actually a health journal, and it was a book written out of that I read it in. And then the parallel, the medicos in Newcastle and Sydney are saying, well, no, it's actually the raw sewage that's killing people here and giving them typhoid. Those that are away from that system with their rainwater harvesting systems aren't sick. So, so these stories and misconceptions are long held, and 150 years ago we're still having the chat. 100 years into the future, if we're still here, we'll be still having that chat. So basically, the first one you've said to me, remember I said we had the 15 epidemic health studies, sorry, I can't say that, health studies that showed the people who are drinking rainwater weren't as sick as those drinking mains water, or their health was equivalent or better. So we've had that. Well, okay, what's going on? What we've talked about so far is, what falls on the roof doesn't necessarily end up in the storage. But you've got a particular question here about, which someone wrote into you, what if the fecal loading from birds on your roof is causing high nitrogen loads, and therefore you need an end-of-line treatment remedy? And this is a double whammy of misconceptions. So let's talk about the end-of-line treatment first, and then we'll talk about whether or not the concern is even valid. Well, no end-of-line treatment is currently being recommended, like ozone, chlorination, and so on, will do anything about nutrients, will it? Not going to remove nitrogen from water supply. I'm not
No.
going to remove any physical or chemical contamination.
Yeah, that would
Filtration.
be targeted bacteria and viruses, right? UV, chlorine, ozone.
And I'm having a go at this because this is a common misconception. Oh, I've got problems with, some chemical, so I'm going to put a UV light on and everything will be fine. No, no, no. So let's talk about whether or not this particular instance is even realistic. When you first told me about this and we did a webinar on this, I said to you, is this a fisherman who has a flock of pelicans who lives on his roof all year round? Because it would take a lot of bird poo from a lot of birds to completely coat your roof to influence the nutrient content of your water to that level. And it's just completely unrealistic. Well, we might have a fisherman, and maybe that'll be the case, but it's um, not likely, and it's probably an unrealistic concern unless you're a fisherman with a flock of pelicans living on your roof.
Okay,
So
well, let's say there was much significantly higher than maybe your average urban property fecal contamination from birds on your roof. So then back to kind of tying this to our earlier conversation, well, that could increase the nitrogen content of your harvested rainwater. Could it also possibly introduce some harmful bacteria or viruses into your storages as in terms of the first place, correct? This is following the thinking.
let's separate those two. You're talking
Okay.
about microbial contamination, you're talking about nitrogen loads.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to separate those out because the nitrogen loads, you would need a lot of bird poo to actually have some influence on the nitrogen load that would enter your tank. And then your rainwater storage does things to nitrogen. But just concentrating on nitrogen from a moment, um, rainwater is a natural nitrous oxide. There's nitrogen in the atmosphere. So there is a small amount of nitrogen in rainwater, but it's a natural organic nitrogen. It's pretty good for humans and it's really great for plants. So, um, after rainfall, you will see your plants in your garden will actually grow very well, far better than if you're watering it with your own, like a mains water source or some other source of water.
Mm-hmm.
With the microbial type contaminations, we've discussed this earlier, but what falls on the roof, birds are a secondary source of concern, not a primary. They're not a higher order mammal. Um, they might have Campylobacter, which is a very fragile bacteria. They might have Salmonella, more unlikely. It's also a very fragile bacteria that's unlikely to survive on the roof space. They might also have a secondary version of Cryptosporidium. Um,
Right.
so the type of Cryptosporidium that's harmful to humans is the one that comes from calves, cattle. The type carried by birds is a different strain. Is far less harmful, if harmful at all, to humans. So it's just working out. We tend to generalize about risk, which is probably not the best idea. So that's why we're doing this design course, aren't we, Michelle? We're just saying, what's
Mm.
the risk? How do we deal with it? So
And a lot of um I mean, and a lot of misunderstanding around these risks. I mean, I've even heard someone, drop avian bird flu as a concern around harvesting rainwater from a roof. And there's all these things that we hear about and we're scared, but we don't really understand.
there is, it's earlier on, I talked to you about pathways of harm or pathways in infection. Um, it is impossible using a logical pathway infection to get avian bird flu from rainwater harvesting. It's just so you get that comes from um, breathing in the virus, which can make you ill. It's just not possible via that rainwater harvesting process to even obtain an illness that way. So you have to have a credible pathway. And I think in this course we need to actually draw some risk pathways for different types of contaminants. So no, avian bird food doesn't apply to rainwater harvesting.
Mm-hmm. Another concern that I think often gets waived is legionnaires, which you've brought up. One particular issue that was written into me was a concern around legionnaires being an issue, particularly in irrigation systems. And the suggestion was that that would be one reason to do end of line treatment to prevent legionnaires from irrigation systems, because irrigation is where you might actually be atomizing.
So are they irrigating with hot water, are they?
Well, and this is why, yes, exactly. And I no, I'm sure they're not.
So,
But another
so
really good example of not understanding, hearing these buzzwords, hearing these risks, but not really understand. Nor do we want everyone to become microbiologists or
absolutely.
what's the study of pathogens? I don't know what that name is. Um,
Microbiology and a range of immunology comes into it. There's a range of expertise that applies to these things. But as I said before, Legionella species is a ubiquitous bacteria in water. I mean, it's common, it's everywhere, but it's completely harmless. It is only
mhm.
made viable if it's incubated at close to blood temperature, say in a cooling tower or a hospital warm water system, um, and then it's harmful in that warm water environment after it's made viable, provided there's enough Legionella species bacteria to become viable. Um, so in an irrigation system, it's a non-issue. But let's examine this a little more for all other systems. One count of anything doesn't make you ill. So if you've only got, say, 10 counts of Legionella species and you're, for some crazy reason, you're watering your garden from a cooling tower that's at, heating water to what, 44 degrees and 45 degrees, and it's been incubated in there. But you've got a very low concentration of now viable Legionella in your. So I'm giving you a very unlikely situation, but let's go with it. And then you're irrigating. You then have to. Someone has to be near that irrigation and have to actually breathe in an infectious dose of that Legionella aerosol. So it's not one count. So there's a whole chain of impossibilities with assuming that Legionella is an issue with irrigation. So
And barriers, there's all these natural barriers that we probably have this tendency, especially as engineers, to not want to count, or we discount them, especially when we look at things from the perspective, from this large centralized supply perspective.
so in even the large centralized supply system, the modern health management thinking is the multi-barrier approach, which just naturally by accident a well-designed rainwater harvesting system has multiple barriers in it, but sitting next to multiple barriers is what we call in health sciences risk pathways. And in many of the things we've been talking about this morning, Michelle, or this morning for me, this afternoon for you, is it can be quite binary. It's impossible to have a risk pathway. Stop thinking about it. And a lot of those, it's impossible while we're thinking about it, are actually issues that are trotted out all the time for rainwater harvesting. So there's multi-barrier thinking that should also be applied to utility water supply systems, and I think that's starting to evolve. But there's also the risk pathways thinking that should also be applied to not only home scale rainwater harvest, should also be applied to a city's water supply system. And they sort of are, but they're not obvious to people. They're hidden in the discussions behind thinking about health risks to humans.
Looking at my list here of questions, another one is around concern of biofilm buildup in, say, rainwater fed irrigation pipes. So the thought process was, if we're going to irrigate with rainwater, we should have some form of disinfection or sterilization. And the reason for that isn't so much because it's a system designed for consumption, drinking water. It's more so to prevent biofilm buildup.
So this again is something that's been borrowed from your utility water distribution system, where they have thousands or hundreds, often thousands of kilometers of pipes, um, and soils and various other materials can get in those pipes as on the way from the treatment plant to households. Um, and biofilms really concern your mains water supply people because they put chlorine in at the treatment plant, then send the water, 100 kilometers or so to a house somewhere. So on the way there, biofilms build up in those pipes because it's impossible to have a pipe that doesn't leak and allow materials in. Um, and the biofilms are actually very good at neutralizing chlorine. So your mains water supply people, um, they need to have a chlorine residual all the way through to the household because rightly or wrongly, that's what the standards are for their behaviour. So they don't like biofilms. There's a lot written about how biofilms are a massive problem in the
In
water.
the utility main water systems.
Yeah.
Mhm.
In rainwater, as we've talked about, by the time the water comes out of the storage for supply, it's a very low nutrient environment. Its potential to grow biofilms, because it's already been growing them inside the storage, is actually quite low. Um, so it's a low issue.
Mm.
Thank you. It's a low risk issue, Michelle, and um, over a long period of time, maybe the irrigation nozzles, if they're using drippers, might need to be cleaned out, but you need to do that with any water source. So it's
Yeah, I totally get it. This might come up often. Systematically misleading assumption.
don't we love that?
I don't know why I struggle to say that. three, three, three words with lots of syllables back to back. All right, another one tied to pH, which we've talked about too, is this idea that really we want to test and remedy for pH because of system failures due to copper pipes, particularly older plumbing, and increasing the likelihood of lead leaching.
So we talked about this earlier on, but I'm glad we're talking about it again because this would apply to any household system with any water source. So you're really not remedying for low pH, but the low pH, naturally low pH in rainwater is not an aggressive low pH because it's not driven by a chemical contamination. It's just the natural structure of rainwater.
And that
It
was, I'll point out, I mean, that might be entirely a new concept to many of our listeners, as it was to me the first time we had this conversation, that a low pH driven by, some sort of a chemical is entirely different than a low pH, the natural low pH of rainwater. and that they're not the same thing whatsoever. pH is just an indicator of something, right? Not necessarily in of itself a bad thing. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And because the low pH in rainwater is not buffered by some major chemical contamination, it's transformative and not as aggressive as, say, a liquid that's got an acid in there that's driving the low pH.
Mhm.
So that moderately low pH will buffer quite easily naturally.
Meaning that over time it'll increase closer to a neutral pH.
Closer to about 6.5, but we're not really aiming for neutral here. Neutral's a hangover from they need neutral in a mains water system to make their other chemicals they're adding to the treatment process to work properly. And it's somehow ended up in rainwater, and people systematically misleading, right, Michelle? So, but in that question, the real answer is you're not buffering a potential perceived low pH in your rainwater. You really need to be thinking about whether or not your plumbing is adequate. So, if you've got lead leaching from older plumbing or poor quality plumbing fixtures, you need to replace those fixtures. If you've got lots of copper leaching from your copper plumbing, that will happen with the mains water system too, because you've got poor quality copper plumbing in place.
Mhm.
Or the other thing that um, corrosion engineers will understand, if in your plumbing system you mix different types of metals, you create what's known as corrosion circuits, which has nothing to do with pH. So if you have galvanized iron connected to plumbing, it creates its natural corrosion circuit. So they'll actually the different metals because of the way their atoms behave and their electrons behave, they'll corrode each other very aggressively. Nothing to do with the water. Um, so if in your plumbing system you've got iron and leads and nickels connected to copper, what you've got is a massive corrosion circuit. So even with no water in the system, they're going to just keep corroding away because the different types of metals are aggressive to each other. So
Mhm.
copper and iron, copper and nickel, copper and lead don't work very well together. They create natural corrosion circuits. So
Mhm.
sorry, we're going off into all sorts of disciplines in this rainwater course, but worthwhile, I think.
What are your thoughts on, and because I've seen it, and I believe B805 talks about including water temperature control in your storages.
Um, you know what? I'm quite surprised to see this. In Australia, our climate's different to you guys. Our above ground rainwater storages, some of this rhetoric comes from Australia, from the more anti rainwater industry, where it's assumed that, oh, your rainwater storage will be boiling, therefore it's going to be really unhealthy because the atmospheric temperature is hot. But anyone who knows physics and thermodynamics know that's not possible because a body of water is actually thermal mass. So it has very stable changes of temperature, even if the atmospheric changes are different. It makes even less sense to me in somewhere like Canada, where your storage might be underground below the freeze line and your temperature's going to be the same all year round, I expect. Or there might be
Yeah.
slight changes in temperature.
Mm.
Um, no real need for temperature control unless you're putting an above ground storage in the back of Calgary somewhere, and you might need to keep the water warm in the winter or else it become an
Well,
ice.
okay, and I should caveat that water temperature control. I don't think that has anything to do with keeping your water from freezing. I think that has more to do. I think the concern is around in certain back to the legionnaires in certain temperature ranges. If your water gets warm, you could be creating an environment for bacteria to proliferate.
Absolutely not likely. So it's just from a pure physics perspective, I can't see how you could get your rainwater storage water to 45 degrees, even if the ambient temperature around that storage is 60 degrees. It just, we'll do the maths later, maybe in the course, to show how this can't happen. But also, with the rainwater treatment train, good design we're talking about, if there's any Legionella species in the storage, storage is not going to get to 45 degrees and stay there for a long period of time. And it's certainly not going to have enough contamination in there to actually create this problem. So I think that's been grabbed from somewhere and said, oh, yes, this will apply to rainwater harvesting without being thought about, to be brutally honest, Michelle.
Would aeration in your tank be something, or can you think of times? I should keep it. I've seen engineers recommend aeration for rainwater storage. Rainwater
Again,
storages, particularly ones that might sit for a few months at a time without being used.
so again, with we seem to be borrowing from lakes and rivers, not rainwater storages. Um, Low nutrient environment, um, just sitting there is no problem at all. We aerate lakes that sit still for long periods of time because they've got high nutrient inflows. It's because we're actually trying to combat the algae, blue-green algae growth. Mm-hmm. Again, it's something that's been taken from something that doesn't apply to rainwater harvesting. It says, oh, it might apply to rainwater harvesting. Well, it actually doesn't. With the one, not aeration, but the one criteria I talked about before with bladder storages, you can't completely seal a rainwater harvesting storage because you might make it anaerobic. So there must be a way for air to get in there. You don't need to aerate it. So
and
that
the bladder storage being those, I think of those wine bags, the boxes of wine you can buy, and those little bags inside. That's kind of a mini version of those bladder storage tanks, is it not? That's the idea, right? They're these.
That's the idea, and if you drink wine out of that sort of storage, and you think of it 100 times the size, you can see it's impossible for any air or oxygen to get into that. It's good for delivering wine, but not good for delivering rainwater. So,
quality of rainwater.
So if you've got a normal rainwater design, water, air can enter that system and it will be fine. So I think the thing to think of in your Canadian environment where you might put the underground storage below the freeze line is to make sure there's ways for air to access that storage. But that would not be your aeration in the context that this person has raised it with you, because that's been borrowed from blue-green algae concerns in high nutrient.
Yeah. And the aeration systems are not were not recommended for bladder tank. It was for a storage that was going to sit unused for a few months, a year, like a cabin type scenario, right? Okay.